We're thrilled to have all of you here today for what has become a very popular annual feature of the Aspen Ideas Festival. Since the very first one, and working with the same firm, and of course always working with the Atlantic and with Penn, Schoen, and Berland, we have done a poll that we have tried to match with some of the themes and tracks and threads of the festival. So given the theme that we have this year, imagining 10 years from now, we commissioned a poll looking at just those issues and tapping into American public sentiment about not only current trends and current views, but really looking forward a decade and what Americans think that decade will bring to them. As last year, we have a fabulous panel to discuss this and a wonderful person to present the results in Mark Penn, who's now Executive Vice President and the Chief Strategy Officer for Microsoft. Before that, he was Worldwide Chair of Burson-Marsteller, CEO of Penn, Schoen, and Berland, which he founded 35 years ago, Mark, and ran for much of that time. He has incredible experience in polling. He, of course, was the White House pollster for President Clinton. He was the chief strategist for Hillary Clinton in her presidential campaign. He wrote a wonderful book called Microtrends, which he discussed here at the festival. And given the kind of work he does and the work he now does for Microsoft, he's sort of a certified futurist himself. So instead of doing polls, you can just ask Mark what's actually going to happen in 10 years, and he'll tell you. Dan Baer is Mark's successor as worldwide chair of Burson-Marsteller and chairman of Penn, Schoen, Berland. He was the chief speechwriter for President Clinton, communications director in the White House. He also was a key leading figure in the extraordinary growth of Discovery Communications. Before that, he was a journalist and a lawyer. And I have to say, he's really become a key partner in much of what the Aspen Institute does, not just at the Ideas Festival, but many of our other enterprises as well. And finally, James Bennett has a new title since the last time he was before you. He's president and editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, and our partner and co-conspirator in countless endeavors, and really the key figure in the partnership that exists between the Atlantic and the Aspen Institute. He was named editor 9 years ago. He's been involved in the Ideas Festival ever since. And I think it's fair to say, and David Bradley would certainly agree, that the Atlantic's meteoric rise and success, winning all kinds of accolades, national magazine awards, has much to do with James' leadership. Indeed, Ad Age has recognized him as the editor of the year, not once, but twice. So what we're going to do, as we've done before, is have Mark present the results of this poll. It'll take a little time to go through that. You'll see it as he goes through it. And then once he's done, I will ask a couple of questions and reactions from our panelists, and then hope we'll have plenty of time to get your questions as well. So Mark.
Thank you, Elliot, for that kind introduction. And we're pleased to, I don't know if it's the 10th annual poll, but it's up there.
It is.
And I'm going to take you through the results of the poll. It's 2,000 online interviews, right, reflective of the general population, done fairly recently at the end of May. Margin of error plus or minus 2%. And what I'm going to do really is take you through the data. It's available online. We've put up an article at the Atlantic. And the poll goes through what Americans think they've been through, and particularly where do they think the country is going, right? And so, interestingly, had we taken this poll at the dawn of the millennium, I think we would have gotten an extremely optimistic reading. Instead, today, I think you'll see a fair degree of pessimism, uncertainty, questioning of America, particularly as it comes to where our economy is going. A huge degree of uncertainty about the country. even though there are going to be some issues like the social fabric, and not just because I'm from Microsoft, that technology is one of the shining rays of hope, I think, through this poll. But rather than spend a lot of time on conclusions, what I really like to do is take you through the data itself, right? So that you understand how Americans are thinking. First of all, do you think America will be on the right track or headed in the wrong direction in the next 10 years? 35% right track, 37% don't know, 28% wrong direction. If you look at that, only 35%, or about a third, are really optimistic that this country is going to be better off in the next 10 years than it is now. That's pretty consistent with the fact that about 2/3 of the country think that we're on the wrong track now. Do you think America will be considered the land of opportunity in 10 years? Wow, 42% say no. Only a third say yes, right? So it's not the top 1%, it's sort of the top optimistic third against a really questioning, uncertain 2/3. 10 years ago, do you think that people who worked hard and played by the rules were more or less likely to get ahead? 61%, more likely. In the next 10 years, only 30%. 49% think that they're less likely to get ahead. So working hard and playing by the rules, the basic bargain of America, is under question. Do you think, interestingly, we took a look at this by race. Do you think America will be considered the land of opportunity in 10 years? White Americans, 29%. African Americans, 45%. Latinos, 47%. More likely to get ahead in the next 10 years. A very similar pattern that actually, for the first time that I can recall in my polling life, which goes back, unfortunately, now about 40 years, African Americans and Hispanics are now among the more optimistic about their future. The wealth gap, 66% expect that it's going to grow in the coming 10 years. Math and science, higher education, what's going to happen? Do you expect the US to rank higher or lower, right, in these key areas in 10 years? 44%, lower. The public school system, 10 years from now, do you think American public school system is going to be better or worse than today? 47% worse. Again, when you think of America, you think of a country of can-do optimists. We've actually been through a decade now where the country thinks it's been going through times that they consider on the wrong track. And they're looking forward and they're saying, wow, I think the next 10 years may be like those last. School options, what do they think is the best option for school-aged children? Private school. 10 years from now, private school. Interestingly, number 2, right, if you look at it, aside from don't know, is right? Well, I wouldn't say number 2 is public schools, 23%, then homeschooling, and charter schools only at 10 or 11, right? I think more ways to go in terms of expanding their reputation, I think, in the overall community. Importance of a college degree? Absolutely, 56% say it's going to be more important in the next 10 years. Can you afford it? Absolutely not. 50% expect they won't be able to afford to pay for their college education, compared to 29%, close to that very optimistic 1/3. In 10 years, will it be easy or difficult for children to find good jobs? Well, difficulty won out here. 64% expect it to be difficult, 25% expect it to be easy. Hard times for kids finding jobs. But the one anomaly, perhaps in the entire poll, is if you're a parent, in 10 years, do you think your children will be better off than you were at their age? 60% said yes. I would say it's the one finding where people must have had really crummy childhoods themselves, okay? Because no matter how bad they think the future is going to be, they still think it's going to be better than what they had, right? Women, more pessimistic than men. If you look at that, do you think in the next 10 years we'll be worse off? Women, right, only 44% better off financially, only 31% say off to affording retirement. Only 18% of women say that we'll be able to afford a child's college education. Only 54%. So men in general had a view of greater economic security in the future than women did. So let's take a look at foreign affairs for a few minutes. The indispensable nation, you know, if the age of possibility in the first section became an age of impossibility, in the second section, the indispensable nation becomes a more dispensable nation. Do you think America's global standing will be on the rise or the decline in the next 10 years? 43% decline, 30% rise. What are the superpowers going to be in the future? China, US, Russia, and Japan. The US came up as the second most mentioned country by Americans. Obviously, where they think is China is rising. In fact, which country do you think will be the world's biggest economic force in 10 years? China, 53%. The US, 20%. In 10 years, do you think there'll be more or less peace? Well, 55% expect a more tumultuous, less peaceful world. If you look at that, millennials, 28% say more peace, and those over 65, even more pessimistic about the world situation. Only 15% say more peace. In 10 years, do you think the US will have engaged in armed conflict with any of the following countries? 45% named Iran as the most likely combatant. Russia second, China third, at less than a fifth. If you take a look at our ability to govern ourselves, 2/3 are convinced Americans will not, are not convinced Americans will be more unified in the 10 years ahead. So we asked them, do you think Americans were more or less unified as a people 10 years ago? 49% say more, 32% say less. Now thinking forward, do you think we'll be more unified as a country? 33% think more unified, 41% less unified. So they see our society as having larger divisions and that we're going to stay divided. Now again, let me just comment for a moment. The public isn't always right in its projections. Sometimes when the public is in its deepest mode, things turn around and we become more united. Sometimes quite the opposite happens. Part of, I think, the commentary is the difference between opinion and what people think is really going to happen. Size of government, people expect it to get bigger, but is it going to get more or less effective? Here I'd say there was neither pessimism or optimism. There was complete division. A third didn't know, a third less effective, and a third more effective. Where are we going to make progress? Here's where the public, I think, showed a little differentiation. Energy independence is the big area where we expect America to make a big difference. Homeland security, national defense, even health care was split almost evenly. We expected to go backward on taxes, traditional family values, the rising cost of education, and they didn't expect a solution to the national debt or the budget problem. They expected that to get worse rather than better. No doubt, a future topic for a lot of Aspen seminars. Do you think the Affordable Care Act will be here or be like in 10 years? 35% it'll exist with major changes. 32% no longer exist. Only 18% expect that it won't go through some revisions. Will we have a national health care system? Probably yes, 38%. Don't know, private health care, 27%. Here they're beginning to predict the future. Do you expect to have more or less privacy? Well, less privacy. You think that's going to be good or bad? Worse. Do you think we're going to have more gun violence in 10 years? 58%, more gun violence. Do you think we're going to have more gun control laws in the US? More gun control laws, 58%. So they think we're going to have more laws that are going to be less effective because we're going to have more gun violence. Interestingly, while Americans were usually united on the American dream and economic opportunity, they were usually divided on social issues. Here, if you look at it, 75% believe that same-sex marriage will be legal in a majority of US states in 10 years, and that marijuana in 10 years will be legal in a majority of US states. They see an emerging social consensus. Do they think that the effects of climate change will be more than today, a majority? How will we know that? More extreme temperatures and more extreme storms. What's going to happen to the family unit? Do you think we'll have fewer children than Americans are having now? Yes, 54%. Now, right now, we're actually at about 2.2, so that would actually imply perhaps negative population growth minus immigration. And do you think children in the United States will be raised better or worse in 10 years? Well, they're going to turn out better, but they're going to be raised worse. So in 10 years from now, do you think we will have elected the following? A female president, 67%. High confidence in that. Hispanic, African-American president, which we already have, and 14% a gay president. Okay, technology. In 10 years, do you think the advancements in technology, so-and-so, will make life better or worse? 63% better. Interestingly, Americans' faith in technology is perhaps the single unshaken element in this poll, right? And if you look at it, 60% believe that it's going to continue to get better in the next 10 years. And which group of people will be considered leaders in our society? Tech leaders came out as number one, political figures second, general business leaders third, celebrities fourth, philanthropy fifth, athletes sixth. Okay? Would that be the case? So it'll be interesting to see what develops here in terms of role models in America, but you see the interest in technology and technology leadership. What's going to happen to our communication? Today we prefer face-to-face. In the future, we're going to prefer communication through technology, 41-44. And what are we going to have widespread in our life? Robots, drones, and medicine capable of monitoring and reporting changes in our body. We'll have all of these things in our future, according to the average voter. What's going to happen to information? More information than ever, but it comes with a social cost. Privacy is consistently seen as the one concern that people have about privacy. Impact on social media made life better, will continue to make life better, although some doubt and uncertainty about that, as the numbers are lower here, 41 and 36%, than you see for general technology, where it's 63 and 60%. TV service. Will you have live TV? Yes, 45. Exclusively streaming TV shows, 26. Don't know, 29. Consider that good news for the TV industry, that 45% believe that regular TV or the cable and satellite industry will continue to be important. And they had a number of other things. What's going to happen to religion? We're actually seeing the US public a little less religious, though people who are currently religious said in the future they will be even more religious in the next 10 years. 52% saying they will attend more frequently if they attend now. Not a good picture for marriage. 56% said marriage will be less common, and 63% said divorce, which is already 1/2 of all marriages, will be even more common. So there will be continued less marriage, more divorce. Car ownership, however, will remain stable. About 77%, they expect it 75%, and children at 72%. Frequency of driving, probably a little less frequently of driving, I think, but you saw stable car ownership. But will we be driving electric cars? Only 20% expected us to be driving electric cars. And will the price of gasoline increase another $2? Will we have $6 or $7 gas? 69% expected the price of gasoline to go up, even though they said that energy independence was the key area that they thought we would make progress in. Airline delays, longer rather than shorter. Weight, we were thinner 10 years ago, and let me make sure I got this right. In 10 years, we expect to weigh less 10 years from now. It's today that's the problem. We will be reading fewer printed newspapers and magazines, though I always make the point that there are more news junkies and more people than ever reading news and information, just not in printed form. Though they expected printed books to continue as a cherished and utilized format to a greater extent than they said about television or newspapers, 50%. So 10 years from now, how popular will each of these be? Football, basketball, they were the leaders. Basketball third. Lacrosse didn't seem to have as bright a future. Tennis, golf, boxing, and snowboarding were on the lower end of sports that we're seen as going to be more popular. So good numbers for soccer. If you're soccer, you might have 10 years ago have been down in the lacrosse part, at least in terms of a survey of Americans. So I would say the traditional sports plus soccer is really coming up. A little bit more on ultimate fighting and hockey. Movie going, people expect to go to fewer movies. Well, let me just make sure that people are going to go to fewer movies. Only 11% thought they'd be going to the movies more frequently, 27% less frequently. Most people said about the same. And finally, will we have The Simpsons 10 years from now? No, The Simpsons will be gone. So I think this gives you a picture. I don't want to take any more time because we've got a great panel. I think as you sum it up again, this is a very pessimistic public coming off of 10 years of seeing the country in the wrong direction. They are optimistic about technology, but pessimistic about our economic future. Optimistic that kids will be better off than they were, despite having trouble with education, jobs, inequality, and almost all of the basics of daily living. They expect government to get bigger. They expect continued divisions in society. They expect more of a social consensus. And they look at a future where there will be more technology, robots, drones, and advanced medicines. So that's the picture they give. Now let's see what the panel thinks of that picture and what our future will really look back like in America and at Aspen. Thank you.
Well, I'm actually not sure we should thank you for that, Mark. Fairly sobering. Don, let me just start with you. Very pessimistic overall. Mark suggested a few threads that may be optimistic. How can you find some more optimism in there for us?
Look, it's a grim picture, and clearly people are reflecting a lot of what they feel now and projecting that forward to the next decade. So we have to take all that into account. I try to be an optimist here. You noted that Mark and I both have a relationship or have had one with the Clintons and President Clinton. President Clinton, when he started on the national stage, always used to quote his professor from Georgetown University, Carroll Quigley, who taught American civilization. And Quigley had this thing called future preference. And Bill Clinton sort of used that as the basis for a lot of his talking about why America could always be better. And future preference had two components to it. One, it was the belief, and it was basically a fundamental thing that President Clinton and Quigley said made America different from much of the rest of the world. And number one was the belief that the future could always be better than the past. And number two was that each and every one of us had a moral responsibility to make that happen personally. So what seems to happen in this poll is that the second thing is still there. Everyone feels a lot of responsibility for themselves to sort of try to make the world better. but they've lost the faith that the future will be better than the past. And that creates some real disjunctions. But if you look deeper into these numbers, in addition to the Hispanics and the African Americans being very aspirational, the one thing that I look at are the millennials, right? And one of the slides that we didn't show says that majorities of Americans of all ages believe that the millennials will be the most important generation 10 years from now. And, you know, the oldest millennials are now 34.
With Generation X.
With Generation X, right, sorry.
Speak up.
the oldest millennials now are 34 years old. So notwithstanding those of us who are baby boomers up here, the millennials probably will have a much greater impact on social and economic opportunity going forward from 2024 onward than any other generation, and will have more of an impact on American society and the economy than any generation since, the baby boomers. So if you look deeper at what they say about some of these things, there are some reasons to be more optimistic. Now, younger people are typically more optimistic, we know, except this generation, the millennials, has taken a pretty hard hit, we know, in unemployment numbers and things like that. But just think about some of these numbers. They are more likely to say they will be better off financially in 10 years by a big number, 60%, compared to only 48% for the whole population. They're most likely to believe that the middle class will grow. Now, it's still not a majority, but 43% of millennials think that the middle class will grow compared to only 31% for the whole. They're a bit more likely to believe they'll own their own businesses, which is a good thing. They are less likely to think there will be a major terrorist attack on American soil. By 45% say they think there will be, compared to 57% for everyone for the whole. And they are less likely to believe that if you work hard and play by the rules, you'll do less well 10 years from now if you get that. So only 42% of millennials say you'll do less well if you work hard and play by the rules, compared to 49% of the whole. And just to follow up on the last of these slides, something that I think probably represents a real sense of optimism on their part, only 51% of millennials think that The Simpsons won't be on the air 10 years from now, so compared to the whole of 64%. So, you know, maybe, let's hope that that younger generation and some of its spirit is going to help to move us forward.
James, what about the tension between people's generally negative views about the macro prospects for the economy, for the United States, and their contrasting optimism about their own children's future?
Yeah, I mean, that Mark called out that one really surprising result in the poll, that 60%, I think is the figure, think that their kids will be better off 10 years from now than they were at the same age. I actually think there's some other examples within the data, and maybe that I'm misinterpreting it, where we see people being a little more optimistic about their own lives than they are about the country as a whole or the middle class as a whole. So macro level, pessimistic, micro level, more hopeful, and that's possibly grounds for us to be more optimistic about the macro level. My favorite statistic like that in the poll was that Mark called out the statistic about people's pessimism about marriage, that the figure is something like 50% think there will be less marriage in 10 years. On the other hand, 86% of people who are married today expect to be still married in 10 years. Which,
the same person.
Which, again, it's unclear, and I'd like Mark to clarify that, and this is probably what they're talking about over at the Love and Life in General panel, so I don't want to get too deep into it, but that obviously flies in the face of the statistics about divorce in this country and is hopeful. People, pluralities or majorities, expect to be living better in 10 years, they expect to be healthier in 10 years, they expect less stress in their own lives in 10 years. They worry about paying for their kids' education, but again, expect their kids to be doing better. And I think 50% expect to be doing better themselves in 10 years than they're doing today. They thought they were doing better, 50% thought they were doing better 10 years ago than they were now. 50% expect to be doing better in 10 years. So again, the problem is right now. And it may be that people are perceiving things are getting a little better in their own lives, but all the messages they're getting about what's happening nationally and globally are so negative that they think everybody else is going to be suffering.
What about something else that Mark pointed out? And by the way, the full survey, and Mark only shared highlights of it with you, is on the Atlantic website and
Yeah.
probably the Ideas Festival website as well. So you can look at it and slice and dice even more finely.
That's theatlantic.com.
Atlantic.com. I thought extremely interesting were the results about the difference of the attitudes between African American, Hispanic Americans, and other Americans. And as Mark said, I haven't seen anything like that in a poll before, and especially Hispanic Americans, even more than African Americans. They were more optimistic about America, about themselves, about the country, about the prospects for American unity, about their own financial stability, about their chances of owning a business in the future. These are all things that came out if you look in more detail, about affording their own retirement, about effectiveness in government. What's going on there?
Well, look, I think they are an aspirational group of people, right? Many of them are first generation and have come here. We know traditionally first generation Americans come here, look at the situation here and the possibilities that exist here as compared to where they have come from, and think that this is a land of opportunity. Now, clearly not all Hispanics are first generation at this point, but I do think that there's a greater belief that what they put into the system, the work that they put in when they work hard and play by the rules, it's going to pay off for them.
I mean, again, many of you are here just obviously for this second session, but if there was a subtext in much of the first session of the Ideas Festival, it was wither the American dream.
Yeah.
And yet this survey suggests that at least in the parts of many people who think the dream is further away in terms of their current economic attainments, they're still dreaming.
Somebody
and,
who
and
was
with
here,
optimism.
well, someone who was here in the first session, one of your guests, Jason Furman, who's the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors in the White House. I was talking to him as we were flying out on long delayed flights from Washington on Friday night and trying to find out what policy could we undertake right now that would help to sort of stimulate the economy in a consistent and persistent way. And his number one thing was immigration reform. That the more we can bring people here, the more that we can sort of restoke the sense of energy that goes into this economy, the better off we're going to be.
And James, one of the Mark looked at technology with optimism. Maybe it was with your Microsoft hat. I mean, I think a fair reading of the entire poll showed some ambivalence actually about technology.
I think there's some signs of ambivalence. The social media figure you showed, for example, it's surprising to me. Was it 41% say it's made their lives better? It just surprises me that that number is not higher. And I think it suggests what a lot of us probably feel, which is that we're more distracted, that we're not actually entirely sure that we're getting better information, and that our lives are richer because of that. And they're worried about how it's going to affect them in the future. And the other big area is obviously technology and surveillance.
And privacy.
Yeah, and privacy, and where people are concerned about the government's ability to monitor us. They expect to be, by an overwhelming majority, it's over 70%, I think, in the poll, expect to be basically on camera all the time in 10 years. They're a little less certain that's a bad thing, but they don't really love the idea.
There was an interesting anomaly in the research coming back to the millennials on tech. So if you remember that slide about who will be the leaders of society 10 years from now, and tech leaders spike up, I think it was 44% say it's going to be technology leaders. Millennials say only 33% of millennials say that. So, and you would have thought that younger people would say, well, the technology leadership is going to be the leadership of society, but they don't say that. So they have an ambivalence. That generation, which has really grown up in the technological revolution that we all experience now, perhaps has more ambivalence than even the rest of us.
But can I go back to the question you asked a minute ago, because I'd love to hear these guys talk about the flip side of the questions of the relative optimism of blacks and Hispanics. It's the relative pessimism of whites. And so how do we explain that?
Well, first of all, I think you explain the whole poll in many ways by two macro developments, the economic crisis and the uncertain international situation. And I think the economic crisis deeply affected people's views of the American dream in many ways. And I think what we're seeing unfold now is just on top of what people, as you saw, I think it was such a large percentage that expected we would have a war with Iran, suggests that they have a very uncertain view about the international scene. Then as I think you go to the, a layer down, I think you're seeing that white America is very pessimistic. They're older, they feel more in a strange way, more alienated from the political system. Remember, if you were going to look at their numbers, they largely oppose the current president. African Americans and Latinos largely and overwhelmingly support the current direction the president's taking us in, right? And so there's a huge gulf here, both in outlook, in attitudes towards the president, and in attitudes towards where the country should be taken.
Let me ask about a different kind of gulf. We've talked about Hispanic and African American and white. There also seemed to be a gap between men and women that was interesting. And as I recall, women were much more pessimistic about affording college for their kids, about retirement, about vacations, yet men didn't share that. I mean, what does that say?
There's a whole litany of those things that you might think of as the building blocks of the American dream, except for home ownership, which wasn't in there. That you look at women and they are substantially more pessimistic about the ability to afford those things in the future than men are. And I was surprised by that, in part because when we think about the recession and the economic circumstances, men, I think, were hit very hard, if not harder, in terms of unemployment and loss of jobs than women were. We tend to think of women now as kind of beginning to sort of move and come to the fore much more in the job market than has been the case in the past. And yet there is this fundamental, I think, uncertainty and anxiety about things. The one that I point to is the ability to afford a vacation, which is a very basic thing, and they're worried about that.
Right. The biggest gap, I think, was college education. I would say that this is what's unusual about this finding is that it persists. So whereas the Latino and African American finding is a complete reversal of what I saw in 40 years of polling, in 40 years of polling, women were always, in every poll, more concerned about the economic situation. And so largely, if I went back to when I started polling, the answer to that would have been that men largely controlled the economic futures. And women were not a huge earning force. Most women were not in the workforce at the time.
Now it just means men are more oblivious.
So now,
delusional, I think.
Right, but now you would have expected that because women are solidly in the workforce, you would have thought that perception gap might have closed and that men and women would have more equal views. But you don't. Men typically get in more car accidents and have more drug overdoses because they are more overconfident generally. And women are less confident than men, and therefore I think you see that reflected in the poll, and that trend continues, right? Unabated, I think, in the last 40 years if I went back.
Let's talk a minute about the international perspective. The number with Iran was frankly shocking to me that it was as large as it was. Frankly, also very surprising was the Russia as number two. I mean, and this poll was conducted before the invasion of Crimea, I believe, or maybe
right around that time.
Because I was wondering, it's almost like a Romney observation, and many people think, maybe Romney was right. What do you? I mean, is that a reflection of the media and attention? I mean, why would Americans have that sense about Iran and Russia? Yet, for example, with everything going on in the East China, South China Sea, and all the issues and tension that's existing in Asia seems to be, which really are serious threats, are further down.
A lot of it has to have to do with the media coverage during the time frame that this was being taken and what people are sensitive to. But I think it also does reflect this larger sense of uncertainty and even a fear of chaos in the international system, that it's hard to imagine what we do, what the U.S. does, or anyone can do to try to tame some of these situations that are out there.
I tend to think people are actually really sophisticated about, and maybe this is a rationalization on my part, but very sophisticated about interpreting signals from the media and very sophisticated about their own interests, and they make very good judgments about that. That said, the one result in this poll that just really makes me think that people are actually being profoundly affected by messages they're getting is that superpower result, which showed that people were invited, I think, right? It was an open-ended question to name the countries that will be a superpower in 10 years. And only a minority even mentioned the United States, which is just, that's just not, the US will, unless something really horrible happens, will be a superpower in 10 years. And they overwhelmingly named China. But it is a real, I mean, I interpret that as a real sign of diminished sense of America's
They
standing.
didn't fear China as much as they did Iran and Russia.
See, that's what I thought was interesting, which is they saw China as having huge economic interests in being an economic power, and therefore less likely to be involved in a conflict with us, whereas they saw Iran and Russia more likely to be involved in a conflict, even if they were lesser powers.
That's how it's covered, though. That's how China is covered, and certainly that's how in the last 6 months Russia has been covered, and Iran. People are aware of the nuclear situation and the hostility.
Let's go back to a domestic issue. It was very discouraging about what people thought about math and science and public schools. Looking forward 10 years, they felt that, as I recall, Mark, that our international ranking in math and science would be even worse, given all the attention we're paying to whether it's education reform, STEM issues, it's everywhere, and the public's reaction is it's going to get worse. And then all the focus on public schools, and they're saying again, in 10 years, it's going to be worse. Does that mean that they don't care about these issues, that they don't trust that the government is, and that our civil society is capable of dealing with it? What's going on?
Another thing that runs through this, and we've said it a few times, but not quite this way, is a sense of futility. Like, what can we do about it? And again, not to just talk about the millennials, those who are closest to having been trained in math and science most recently in our schools, are more likely to think we will be lower in math and science around the world than are other people in the country.
Well, the truth is there are so many trends at work. I think they said, look, they were very pessimistic about education overall, because what they said was college was going to be more important. Our schools were not going to be better at producing STEM education, which right now in our society, fewer students choose STEM education than there are jobs for those with STEM educations, despite the fact that they are right now in a shortage of jobs rather than a surplus. And then they said, I think quite strongly, we continue to be concerned about being able to afford college, right? And so I think you saw concern at all levels about education, its importance, how this was going to happen. And so I think that predicts that education is going to reemerge as a new major national issue, right? In a way that perhaps about 15 years ago, it was a huge national issue. We are, frankly, a lot better educated than we were. More people go to college, but the biggest crisis we have is that people do not graduate college after they start college. I think this poll says that there's going to be a reemergence of someone who calls himself an education president in the 21st century.
You talked about one last question, then I'm going to toss it to the audience.
Just a quick
Sure,
follow
please,
on that.
James.
And it's not just about kids and college kids, it's about lifetime learning too, because 58% of people said they're going to need more education in 10 years, and that was true across age groups, basically. They've absorbed the message that they're going to need to continue learning in order to they're expecting to change careers, they're expecting to have different jobs in 10 years. A third of them think their jobs might be taken by a robot. So the issue of education is crossing age groups, I think.
Mark and Don, you've both been message advisors, communication advisors at the highest level of government. Is this poll also a reflection of a failure of political leadership? And what can...
They're going to get us in trouble.
And
That's
what,
a great question.
and what can political leaders, and should political leaders do to change this tone?
Look, I'd say it's not a question of political leadership, failure or not. I think that our society now
Although I
tends...
would like you to answer that question.
I think that our society tends to either get a little over-optimistic or a little over-pessimistic. That our whole information environment tends to promote extremes of over-optimism or over-pessimism, when in fact, oftentimes things come out in the middle. I look at the economic statistics today and I continue to wonder, have we spun things down, more than they're actually spun down, given that 70% will say the economy's in the wrong direction, right, even though we're a long way from a recession.
But I'm not talking about spin now. I mean, isn't it a responsibility of leadership to confront precisely these kinds of
We've
issues?
talked about this here in this very session in the past. So first off, the predominant national message politically right now is one of dysfunction, broken system. They won't work with me, he won't work with us. And all of that, the signal that sends to people is nothing can happen, and these people don't really know how to bring it together to make it happen for us. And the second part of it is it's all about them, the political class, it's not about us, the people. So if that message persists, and it's been persisting now for 4 years or so, it begins to lead, I think, to this sense of futility, that nothing can be done to begin to address some of the problems that we have, and people begin to give up. They don't quite know how to respond because they can't do it all themselves as hard as they are trying. That's number one. Number two, and I learned this working in the White House and working with Mark and others, you have to set what I think of as a sense of realistic optimism. It can't be way out here, because that leads to a disjunction and sort of cognitive dissonance for people eventually, because only so much can be done in practical terms in a realistic time frame. But you do have to set, in my view, a sense of we can get there and we can make things better. And you have to also, and I think you're going to see this come up in the next 2 to 3 years, a sense of who can just get the job done, right? And work with others to get the job done. You heard it yesterday. I'm not promoting her right now, but you heard it yesterday with Secretary Clinton talking about how Newt Gingrich and President Clinton would go at it against one another daily, and then at night they would get together in the White House and they would begin to sort of work things out. I think that the public needs to have a greater sense of that realistic optimism and what you put behind it to make it work.
Because it's pretty hard for democracy to thrive and civil society to function effectively with these kinds of attitudes.
Well, but I just want to add, the country's been through a lot. If you look at the last decade, and I think a lot of what you're doing, we've been through 9/11, we've been through the Iraq War, we've been through the financial crisis, we've been through gridlock in Washington. So you've been through systematic disillusionment of what can we do internationally, what can our financial system do, what can our political system do. And we haven't overcome those 3 disappointments, right? And it's going to take time for us to emotionally overcome that. And I think that's reflected in this poll.
We shouldn't, before we do that, we shouldn't walk away from the part of this poll that reflects consensus, which is quite striking. And we didn't ask people whether they thought these were good things or bad things. So there's not a qualitative judgment there, but at least from the standpoint of social issues that at one time were used rather dramatically to divide the country, or did divide the country, whether they were used that way. You look at the levels of consensus, and they are across the board demographically on things like same-sex marriage and other issues that is quite striking.
All right, let's allow you all to ask questions. We need to wait for microphones because it's all being recorded. So right here in the middle.
Can you describe how long it takes to do this survey, and how long you give the patient, how long you give the individual to answer your questions when you fire all these different questions at them?
Well, today these questions are self-administered online. So it's going to take somebody about half an hour to fully answer a survey like this. What we find today is, surveys, when I started, used to be done face-to-face. Then there's a transition from telephone to online. Online has a lower cooperation rate, but actually people get more in depth because there's no interviewer, and so there's a greater sense of anonymity, I think, and plus they can take it at their own time. There's not an interviewer who's prompting them, so they have as much time as they want to answer it. And this is the kind of survey that people like answering. So you may not like answering, a survey about, soap, but you usually like answering surveys about you and your society. So we actually get pretty good response.
Over in the side, if we can bring a microphone. I'm sorry, I can't really recognize anyone here in this light, but raise your hands a lot high.
Where would you say are the areas of greatest divergence between what people are saying about how they see the future and what is most likely, that future is most likely to entail?
That's interesting. We can't predict the future.
Well,
We don't
Mark
know.
can.
Yeah.
Well, look, I think actually that is the single most interesting question that's always posed by a survey like this, because I always say that the problem with predicting the future is that we usually don't have as good a handle on the present, right? And so we usually live in a present that's about 5 to 7 years old, right? Which is why we discover these TV shows that have been going on for 2 or 3 years we didn't know about. And then we say, wow, I should have watched that. And then, but realistically, for us to see how much movement there has been in education, how much movement there has been in I think, African Americans and Latinos feeling a greater sense of optimism about society, first you have to understand the new present. Now, the reality of the prediction business is, I don't think the Council of Economic Advisors, with all their brainpower, has hit the next quarter growth exactly right for a long time. And so it is pretty iffy. I mean, I think to me the biggest disconnect here is, are we going to solve our budget problems? Are we going to continue to be a country of vast, innovative leadership as we have been in the last decade? Are we going to make more progress than we think we are? And is technology going to bring even more progress than people think? And is in fact the social issues where we think there's a growing consensus going to turn out to be more contentious than we think? So those are probably along the lines that I'd look to wonder what's going to be the difference between perception of reality and reality. And the last thing I'll say is that culturally, it seems to me more popular now to spin our society down than raise it up. And that, the movies I grew up with more or less brought society up, right? The moral character always won. By the time people finish watching House, even Mr. Deeds Goes to Washington, right? But by the time you finish watching House of Cards, you believe it's true, right? And then what happens is the congressmen watch House of Cards and they say, well, maybe I should act like that. Right? I mean, I once did a survey of police because they were concerned that citizens would act like the shows, and it turned out the police who watched the shows wrecked more cars than any other. So I do think we have to be concerned about how we view ourselves and whether that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
You, Randall?
I would add, I can't believe only a quarter of people think we'll make contact with extraterrestrial life. I actually can't believe that many people said we would, and I wish we'd asked them if it would be a good thing or a bad thing. We unfortunately didn't ask that
Or
question.
had we in 10 years?
Okay, Randall, and then I think woman right to.
There's a cluster of 3 of us who have questions for you, Elliot. So following up on this question, it seems like you would actually be able to look back since you've done it for 10 years, and I'm wondering if you actually did look back and see whether the first set of survey respondents were close to being right. And then the second question related to this is, looking back over the surveys that you've done previously, how does this one rank in terms of the level of pessimism? Is this the most pessimistic, or are we actually somewhere in the middle?
Well, we haven't done this poll consistently. It's an interesting poll,
Asking them to look forward.
right, to do in the 20th anniversary. It's an interesting poll to do in the 20th anniversary of Aspen. But having done polls over this time, we are in a period of American pessimism. If I went back to polls from the Depression on, I don't think since the Depression I could find a consistent period in which a majority of Americans thought that we were on the wrong track and then didn't spring back, right? And so you didn't bounce back, say, when Reagan got in office after Carter, or didn't bounce back to even national tragedy of enormous dimension, so that kids who were 12 and are today 22 don't know a moment really in which the country is optimistic, right, in their the upper part of their childhood, the politically aware part of their childhood, and that is unprecedented.
Okay. With a black hat. With a microphone, please.
I was just thinking that maybe it might be interesting if you did a control with the people that attend the Aspen conference to the same poll. And wouldn't it be interesting to find out that they have the same attitude?
I was thinking, Mark and I were talking about that last night. I would
Because
love for us to
maybe-
do this.
Well, here's my other thought, that maybe these attitudes have more to do with existential ideas about life, because our life is changing dramatically. So when you think that it's addressing only economics, or you think it's only addressing, like maybe the issues of insecurity have to do much more with, watching storms, or watching a disaster, or watching, just like, anyway, maybe we're just as, we're thinking that somebody else has these opinions. Maybe we have the same opinions here. We're not above it or below,
Well, we
Very
did-
interesting. We'll use that for any
I would say
final comments too, I'm afraid, because our time is up.
I just want to say that we did do that poll a number of years ago, and the average income of an attendee was about $500,000. So typical wouldn't be the word.
Well, it'd
Jim
be
Rutherford
interesting
had
to
it.
compare it.
Yeah, I mean,
Sorry.
well, yeah, I can leave it there. I can answer that.
Any very brief final comment from any of our panelists?
I guess I decline to believe that it's going to be as bad as it appears it's going to be 10 years from now. Because we look back, you cannot imagine what can happen for the good, what kind of leadership we may have, what sort of developments economically, socially may take place, technologically. And I just still believe the future can still be better than the past.
Well, on that note, we thank our panelists very much. Thank all of you.